Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cybersecurity Sauna. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and I will be your sauna majuri and the host of this podcast. Thank you for joining us for another session where we sweat out the hot topics in security. A successful cyber defense should protect an organization's critical assets from today's threats, not yesterday's. We wanted to sit down with some of the people responsible for keeping tabs on threats and talk about recent developments. Threat intelligence analysts Stephen Robinson and Ziggy Davies study changes, both good and bad, in the threats facing organizations, and they are here to give us an update. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks, Yanni.
Cheers, thank you.
So let me start with the obvious question. What is the number one threat facing companies today?
While the landscape is constantly changing, we do still have some emerging threats, such as the rise of hacktivism and malicious AI. They are new things that are getting more and more dangerous, and we're seeing a lot of change. But it's important to realise that ransomware still remains the greatest threat to most organisations and companies. Not just because it's destructive and highly impactful, but because that landscape itself is becoming more and more harmful and easy for attackers to access. That's obviously attributable to a lot of different things, but the rise of initial access brokers and info stealers has really shaped ransomware over the last few years, for sure.
Right. Yeah. Is that what you're seeing, Stephen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when it comes to the threat, ransomware was the first thing that came to mind for me. But obviously, there's that delivery aspect, like Ziggy said, with info stealers, or supply chain attacks, or those vectors and so on. Looking at the Las Vegas casino ransomware attacks recently, that was essentially ransomware delivered through some pretty old school social engineering combined with taking advantage of that sort of cloud supply chain, that third-party service of Okta.
Yeah.
And so, ransomware is a huge threat, but then those delivery methods, we're just seeing supply chain after supply chain getting targeted. Yeah.
So that was going to be my question. Ransomware has been a threat for as long as I can remember. So is there something, you're talking about delivery methods? Are they changing? So what's changing around ransomware?
It's got to be that delivery through malware as a service and things like that. So taking a look at a Black Hat, which technically was the ransomware, involved in that attack. If you try and look at how Black Hat is delivered, it's kind of a case of, however, the person who happens to be delivering Black Hat at that time decides to try and deliver it. Are they someone who does social engineering? Are they someone who does mass exploitation? Are they just buying access and monetizing that way? So saying ransomware is a threat, that's obviously their end goal, but how they're getting access and what people need to defend against is varied.
Right. Okay. So ransomware is actually just sort of the end result of the attack. What we as defenders should be thinking about is how the ransomware gets deployed.
Yeah. There's some safety net, technologies for preventing, or defeating ransomware detonation, but you'd really hope that we can focus on stopping us from getting to that point.
So, if there's that whole criminal ecosystem of initial access brokers and all that behind it, how do you then, what's a defender to do?
Well,
is it just as simple that if you're vulnerable, you're going to get hit by this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these things where I think technical debt comes in, that whole, you cut corners, or you go, okay, we can't do this thing we know we should do right now, so we're just going to put it on the back burner for a while or whatever. And I think there's a lot of organizations, particularly as budgets get crunched and so on, who maybe cut back on their spending, whether that's the number of people you've got to look at alerts and security, or the number of people to simply do patching, upgrades, management, documentation, all of these things which matter when you're trying to defend yourself.
What about when the Russian invasion in Ukraine kicked off? There was all this talk about cyber Armageddon, where Russian hackers and hacktivists and state-sponsored actors are going to be all up in everybody's business. I'm not sure I've seen that. Am I just missing the signs, or What do you guys think?
Yeah, so the invasion of Ukraine by Russia did open an entirely new sort of front on the war against cyber. Hacktivism, or so-called hacktivism, as I often call it, has been the biggest change we have seen because of that invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine itself has obviously been very heavily targeted, which you would expect, but we've also seen nations who have allied themselves with Ukraine or provided military aid or support in some way, such as Poland and Germany, be heavily targeted as well. Because we've seen such large-scale targeting, it's a very clear picture as well about how geopolitics has shaped these attacks. So we've also seen nations like Finland be targeted quite directly, and we can really clearly see that that's linked to their NATO membership. That has progressed over the past year or so, and the attacks increased along with how that progressed. So any geopolitical action against Russia or in support of NATO is likely going to put people in the crosshairs of hacktivist groups. It is important to realise that the bulk of that activity is DDoS. Now, obviously, WithSecure don't directly deal or defend against DDoS, but many of our friends who work in the industry do. But it is a massive pain, DDoS, but it is only mildly impactful in the grand scheme of things. On the other hand, there has been some cases of ransomware or wipers being deployed. Thankfully, that is much rarer. It is also important at the time, how things change in the news and stuff. We've got the Israeli conflict at the minute. That has created an entirely new front line in this hacktivist space. We do track these groups. If you read my threat highlight report every month that we put out, there is a new section about hacktivism. So this next month, we're going to talk about Israel and show that there's over 100 different groups that have aligned themselves with this war, both on the pro-Israeli and anti-Israeli side of it. Now, the bulk of that activity is also going to be DDoS, but there's also been some other compromises that have been, reported in open source and by third parties that have involved things like industrial control systems and other sensitive systems that, the public do rely upon. We saw that with Ukraine as well. It's a big new aspect of cyber for sure.
You were a little bit critical of the term hacktivist there. Do you think there's, how should I put this delicately, do you think there's coordination or sharing of resources or even tasking that's common to these groups?
I think at least somewhat. It's very difficult to say for certain, but we know from, other reporting by other groups that some of these so-called hacktivist groups are very, very well linked to the state, specifically Russia. We've also linked many other groups to Iran, for instance. We know this is true because of the way they've behaved and the way they've been tracked. I'm going to, side of hesitancy, not say all of these. That's the case for all of these groups. There are going to certainly be groups that are, legitimately hacktivists. It's a collective group of single minds that are acting for a common goal that they believe in for whatever reason. But there's definitely some of these groups that are state-backed and given an objective by a higher power.
One of the things, if you're going to claim that you're a grassroots hacktivist group based in the Middle East, maybe don't, communicate in serial aggression. There was an interesting article recently, and not having done the research myself, I can't kind of comment too much on how accurate it is, but it seemed sourced, which was that some of the pro-Palestinian cyber activity, not necessarily hacking, but just in internet space, seemed to have characteristics of previously Iranian-attributed threat groups. So, you don't know necessarily, is that not a hacktivist group, or is it simply a hacktivist group with state backing, or is it just a state? It's a murky puddle to try and peer into.
Sure. But okay, if we think for a minute that there might be actually like state-sponsored actors behind some of these attacks, where does that leave us as defenders? Like if you read reports of cyber incidents, every one of them was super sophisticated. There was absolutely nothing the company could have done to sort of prevent the attack. But, if you're actually against like a nation-state level operator, is that true a little bit? Like what's a company to do?
Yeah, there is the argument that if an APT wants to get access, they're going to get access. But there are defenses against, for example, a 0 day. There might not be defenses against 5 0 days, but you can definitely, make them work for it. And it's a case of having monitoring in place that you're looking at, having your defense in depth or zero trust as it's called now. It's having something watching the watchers and verifying any anomalous activity going on. And on top of that, even if they do compromise you, they've then got to get the data out somehow. In most cases, we're talking about espionage at least.
What I will say on that as well is obviously these state-backed hacktivist groups, either zero day or some highly sophisticated technique or tactic is passed to these groups, it kind of ruins the illusion of hacktivism. If all of a sudden North Sudan or Kilnut start cracking out 0 days and acting in a really sophisticated way, it kind of ruins that veil of secrecy about them. It would clearly identify that it is state-backed, because these groups ordinarily wouldn't have the funding or resourcing to come out the gate and use that sort of attack.
So do we think then that these are sort of useful idiots in the old Russian parlance, a nice cover that can be also used as a distraction? Like, here are these hacktivists attacking you, but they're also passing some of that information, some of that access to the big boys, and they're sort of sneaking in under the cover of this really in-your-face attack.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I think the information flows both ways. We've seen, obviously, breaches by these hacktivist groups, and the data likely does go back to the nation state that they're working for or in the interest of. But vice versa, there's been suspicions that Russian intelligence has been passing information to these hacktivist groups, who are then leaking it on their behalf, because it is then breaking the connection to Russia itself. But those links are built back up by the intelligence community, and it paints a picture.
Okay. Well, moving away from geopolitics a little bit, we already talked about ransomware sort of being the same but different in the sort of the way it's distributed and the way the attacks develop. What other sort of cybercrime developments do you think our audience should know about?
I kind of feel a bit like a stuck record for the last how many months that I've been going, the professionalization of cybercrime.
Okay.
Because it's just such a big thing. It's not really even just a trend anymore. It's industrialization.
So what do you mean by that?
So as they get these huge profits, they can spend those profits to increase their efficiencies, to achieve more, to have more victims, more profits, more affiliates. And so it's ransomware generating these profits, and all of these cyber criminals, all they really have to do is get access, and then they can monetize it really easily using ransomware. Or even more easily, they can monetize it by selling the access. So initial access brokers, malware as a service as well. There's all these ways that people are selling services to each other in order to make money, and that selling enables pretty much ransomware and data theft. So it's this huge interconnected, complicated ecosystem of attackers, and at the same time, that description applies to our legitimate ecosystem. As we've got these advanced attackers with large budgets to spend on compromising in order to make more profit, they're going to be targeting our big organizations, our supply chains. And that's really, I think, that supply chain attacks, those kind of long-term, highly technical, highly focused attacks that you might otherwise associate with an APT, you are seeing now from cybercrime groups, because they've got the money to do that.
So we're talking about professionalization of cybercrime, but I'm still like, do you guys have like a practical example you could give me?
Yeah, for sure. So Klopp are a really good example. We've talked about them, at length, not just in this discussion, but in the threat highlights reports that we've put out throughout this year. The reason they're a good example of the professionalization of the cybercriminal underworld is because this group, they could just be deploying a basic ransomware. They could be using the same tactics and techniques and procedures that we see elsewhere. But what they're actually doing is they're developing 0 days for these large prolific products that are used in enterprise, like Go Anywhere and Move It. And then they are attacking them at scale en masse with massive resources being dedicated to that single compromise, and then engaging in massive data theft that they're then using to exploit these companies. Not many groups would be capable of that, but Klopp are, and that's because they've clearly got the money, they've clearly got the resources to do this, and that is just a prime example of a professionalized group that is acting at a level which is almost APT, nation state like.
Yeah, it's investment of all those profits. You think about big businesses, Microsoft or Oracle or whoever, and how they could invest huge sums of money into something that might not even work out. It might not even make a profit, but they've got the money, they've got the cash in the bank to just work on something for months with whole teams and just see if it goes anywhere. And I think that's what these major players in the ransomware market are doing as well. They've got the money, they've got the time, and they know that they can monetize that.
So what does that mean for defenders that, this development is happening? So what do our CISO listeners have to do differently?
There's a couple of things. I think if a company is hit at the minute, there's this temptation to keep that fact a secret because, a fear of, share prices falling or the impact of class action lawsuits that may follow if data leaks happen or fines. I can understand that and respect it at a certain extent, but transparency by CISOs and organizations would be much better. I've, certainly never looked down upon a company who's held their hand up and said, we've been hit. That transparency does make it a lot easier for everyone to learn lessons from attacks and be better prepared in the future. I think in short, brushing issues under the rug that unfortunately many organizations do try and do doesn't help anybody in the long term because lessons can't be learned and we can't improve defenses because we don't have the intelligence that can be gathered from those attacks.
Okay. Another thing that people are talking about is obviously AI is big in everything, and there's this specter of AI-powered cyber attacks that are going to come in and wreck everybody's day. Are we seeing anything on that front, anything to justify these fears?
I think there's been a mild adoption of AI so far by cyber attackers, and it is limited in its functionality. There's been known instances of people jailbreaking legitimate platforms such as ChatGPT. That is an ongoing issue, and I'm sure OpenAI are working on the defenses for that sort of tactic. But what is more concerning is the purpose-built malicious AI programs that have started to float about, such as Evil GPT, Worm GPT, XXX GPT, Dark Bard, and Dark Bert, and I'm sure there's many more that are being developed at the minute.
So what are these?
So these are purpose-built malicious platforms that sort of simulate functionality like ChatGPT or Google Bard, but have no limitations. So they will write ransomware code, they will write an info stealer. They don't follow a set of rules. They will do absolutely anything. They will write a convincing phishing script, and that reduces the time it will take for attackers to carry out these attacks or adjust their code, and that is going to be highly problematic moving forward. But what this is an example of, as Stephen's already alluded to, is just another example of the professionalization of cybercrime. This is a product that is just now emerging, but it's going to be a highly saleable product, and it's going to be something that will make cyber attackers and criminals a lot of money. So it's bound to develop in the future, and it's going to make the cyber landscape look very different once the tech improves and expands even more.
Yeah, sometimes think that the power of AI is almost higher for these malicious uses in a way, because one of the issues people have repeatedly said they have with these, LLMs is that it generates plausible, seeming text and facts and so on that isn't actually true.
Mm.
And obviously, if you're trying to communicate with people about a specific thing, you need it to be true. But if you don't actually care if what you're saying is true, you just need to get a response or an interaction, then something plausible but untrue is just fine.
So there's been also talk about how you can use AI to recognize AI-generated like phishing emails or stuff like that. Security is always a cat and mouse game, but are we sort of losing that game right now? Are we not catching up with the criminals? Why are we not automatically recognizing emails that have been AI-generated?
Yeah, that's a really difficult topic to talk on and discuss. I think the issue for us is us as legitimate organisations will always approach things with hesitancy in terms of legality and guidelines, and approaching things properly. As this technology develops, we're not going to simply jump in at the deep end. The criminals aren't going to care for this. They're just going to go head first and go straight into the technology and use it as best as they can, with little regard for the repercussions or how this may sort of spin out of control as these things get leaked. And they ultimately will. We look at ransomware, just to link back to that. The Lockbit, the Conti, the Baybook code leaks led to absolutely tons of newcomers entering the scene who just simply reuse the code. The risk is that these bad actors are going to develop these tools that are AI based, large language model based, and the same may well happen. Obviously, legitimate organisations are going to work within guidelines and work with other companies, and that's not going to be the case for us.
And speaking of that, working in guidelines, if you were kind of to think about how you might get an AI model to recognize AI generated, or non-legitimate emails, well, you'd probably need to train it on a large corpus of legitimate and not legitimate emails, right? So if you are a legitimate organization doing this, you're going to want to do that legally, make sure that the information owners are okay. You're not just going to hoover up all these emails and start training an LLM, well, hopefully. Whereas if you're a malicious organization, you don't care. So you can just go off on that. And I think that's definitely part of it, as Ziggy said. And I think another part is that it is difficult to defend against something that's not happened yet. So in a way that, the cat and mouse game, is it going to have to be a reactive defense? Are we going to have to see what these attacks are like before we can make a defense for them? I think there's definitely behavioral, machine learning based detection for things like this. I think are definitely possible. In a way, if you think about it from a technical viewpoint of the phishing email, it doesn't matter if it's AI generated or if it's a talented human who's generated that phishing email, because the desired effect is always going to be the same. So that behavioral detection that you can apply to emails, I think, is still going to be a defense. Where there will be issues, I think, is around more static detection. If you can very rapidly generate new campaigns, new lures, new infrastructure, whatever, using AI, then you will struggle to have that static defense. But if you've got the ability to behaviorally detect malicious emails, then it doesn't matter where they're coming from, in theory.
That makes sense to me. So, you guys are looking at this stuff, these threats, and as they sort of the theoretical threats, but also threats as they emerge and happen all day, every day. I'm sure there's like trends you're seeing. Is there something you feel that companies, CISOs, are just doing like flat out wrong?
This might be slightly controversial, but I take issue with ransomware insurance, particularly ransomware insurance that will pay ransoms.
So the companies that offer it, not the companies that take it.
Well, either way, really, it's the paying of ransoms is a bad thing because it leads to more ransomware. Like the issue that we've got with that professionalization, with ransomware just being as plague upon our houses, is because it's so profitable. If you get a good ransomware attack in on a large organization, you could be raking in millions, and so they only have to do a couple of those a year to have it succeed. Similarly, if a couple of large organizations a year don't pay, then you could drastically cut the amount of money going into the underground. So I think that's a big thing. And then looking at some of the kind of recent, I don't know if trends is the right term, but recent events, there's been a lot of network infrastructure. So the recent Cisco stuff, FortiGate, firewalls, load balancers, whatever, all of these pieces of network infrastructure that get installed and then left there. And there's been a lot of illustrations that if you leave something connected to the internet for long enough, someone will try and compromise it. And, while I feel very bad for the people who had infrastructure compromised by the recent Cisco iOS XE attacks and 0 days, in order to be compromised by that, you had to have your management interface open to the internet. And that's like a big no-no from the start. So it was slightly depressing seeing the number of devices with their management interface pointed to the internet, which had then been compromised after that came out, because, that's a pretty simple defense that shouldn't be surprising to most people. So I think there are assumptions that need to be questioned to effectively defend your networks.
But that's an interesting example. Like, why do you think that happened? Is it because people were unaware of this attack surface existing, or how problematic it is, or is it because it was just more convenient that way?
It could be that technical debt, again, coming from an infrastructure background, that's a drum I like banging, where either people did not have the time to correctly set things up, they didn't have the budget to correctly set it up, or they didn't have the expertise. Or it could simply be that there isn't policy in place. If you've got someone who knows what they should be doing and how they should be doing it, but they're also being pushed to get something done as quickly and easily as possible, and there is no policy that they have to follow to say, you must have done this, securely, you must have closed these interfaces, you must have whatever, then I think, you're more likely to have these problems. And I don't want to be beating on under-resourced infrastructure teams here. I really don't. If you're a small organization, you're going to struggle to have something, that much to invest in doing these things properly. But if you're not doing it properly, then you are asking for trouble.
Absolutely. So Ziggy, what's if that magical genie came up and gave you one wish, something you could change in the way companies are behaving, what would that be for you?
I've talked about transparency once already, but I think transparency is the biggest thing. Cybersecurity is a war that is getting harder and harder to fight as our adversaries get more technical and use far more sophisticated tools. But transparency and collective joint working and intelligence sharing is the way to combat that. We've seen that a little bit with the work by CISA in the US recently. They've got their ransomware early warning initiative that works with different companies, to let companies know that they may be about to experience a ransomware attack. But also the different, national cybersecurity centres across the globe and the different certs as well. I think that, the takeaway is that the more we know about our adversaries and the better we understand them, the better we can do our job. Sharing intel and understanding common goals is at the centre of that. We have seen some wins recently from law enforcement as well. The shutdown of Quackbot and some ransomware groups like Ragnarwaka. It is important that cyber criminals are pursued in the real world and not just the digital cyberspace. It's important that we don't lose sight of that. It's not just about report writing like, I do, or collecting data like, cybersecurity companies love to do. Criminals can be pursued, arrested, and face the consequences of their actions in the real world as well. But that does rely upon sharing and collective effort.
So on that transparency front, there's been various pieces of legislation passed recently by lots of different organizations, countries, whatever, the EU, which cover transparency and which require particularly critical infrastructure organizations to be transparent, to inform the regulators about cyber incidents that they have and to share threat indicators between them. That transparency, like Ziggy said, is so important, because right now, if you look at ransomware stats, if you look at the statistics that tell us what's happening in the world of cybercrime, the current best source of stats we have are the ransomware groups, who by definition are not going to be a great source of information because they want to be as big and scary and heavily branded as they can. But we need to know what's happening if we're going to defend ourselves. We need people reporting these attempted attacks, successful attacks, the methods going on. There was something recently at a American energy company. They had a successful ransomware attack against them, and they very rapidly and openly published a letter that stated exactly what had happened and how. And the number of security professionals I've seen since then who have said that was a breath of fresh air to see an organization very clearly owning up to something happening and being clear about what it was. That's such valuable information for other defenders. We all learn from each other, and we've all got to focus our resources that we've got on the biggest threats that we're currently facing.
Yeah, and you touched upon law a little bit there, Stephen, and I think there's going to be some changes going forward as well about ransomware specifically with the law. We look at Australia at the minute, and there's laws going through at the moment that will hopefully be enacted about banning the payment of ransoms. Putting guidelines in place for how companies deal with ransomware groups when they are attacked. It's not just Australia, but there's certain states in the US that are looking at similar legislation. I think if that moves forward and that progresses to a state where other nations are looking at ransomware attacks, seeing how impactful they are and saying, well, actually, we're going to make it law that you can't pay these groups. I think that will have a positive effect overall. I'm sure there's going to be some organisations that will still try and pay in secret because of the impact. That's always going to be the case. And I'm sure ransomware attackers will adjust their tactics, techniques and procedures to match. But I think it can, stripping the money away from these cybercrime groups can only be a good thing, because it's at the minute run rampant, and that's what's led to this professionalization of cybercrime.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that's somewhat positive note, or as positive as we're likely to get to anyway. So with that, I want to thank you guys for being with us today and talking us through this topic.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
That was the show for today. I hope you enjoyed it.